Good evening. I think we should try to get started. My name is Linda Vida, and I'm the director of the Water Resources Center Archives, and we're the main sponsor of the California Colloquium on Water. Thank you all for coming to our April program. And I have, a few quick announcements. If you are not now on our email reminder list, we have a sign-up sheet in the back, I believe. We do videotape each lecture, and they're posted on our website about 1 or 2 weeks after the lecture. And we also should have some brochures and postcards. I'm not sure if they're in the back or out in front. And we do have one more lecture after this, May 4th. We have Peter McCarrigan from the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and he's going to talk about groundwater pollution at the lab. So that should be a very interesting talk as well. And it is also my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Meg Caldwell. She received her undergraduate at UC Berkeley in business administration, but she always had a secret plan to study environmental law. After she graduated from Berkeley, she went to Stanford, got her law degree, and then she taught at environmental law at San Jose State, and then got involved in local government and planning. She went back to Stanford to direct their environmental law program, and then has also served on the Coastal Commission and the Coastal Conservancy. She has worked for the state on their Marine Protected Areas program, and is still doing, I think, most of those things, right? And is also the director of the Center for Ocean Solutions at Stanford. So please welcome Meg Caldwell.
Thanks. So thank you so much. Woo! Just one thing that Linda didn't know is that I used to be a Superfund site attorney. So this upcoming talk about groundwater contamination would be super fun for me. When I got out, no, seriously, my best friends are hydrogeologists and toxicologists. When I got out of law school, I actually went straight to a private law firm for about 4.5 years. And that was the 80s. And that was the bread and butter of law firm environmental compliance practice. So I got my fill of working with engineering consultants, which is good. So I also was really heartened when Linda gave me a tour of the archives to learn that the founding professors of the archives were coastal engineers. So I thought I was going to have to kind of justify my talk that, well, you probably hear about freshwater all the time. Well, it's time to hear about the other end of the water cycle. And but lo and behold, coastal engineering is alive and well, and you all do focus not only on freshwater but also on 70-some-odd% of the planet. So that's great. I'm really pleased to know that. The Center for Ocean Solutions, just a really quick one on that. We're relatively new. We're a collaboration between Stanford University and our Hopkins Marine Station and the Monterey Bay Aquarium and the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, which most people know by MBARI. And the whole focus and mission of the center is to elevate the impact of the sciences on ocean policy, so natural, physical, and social sciences. Our work is kind of thrown into 3 bins: ecosystem health and ecosystem services, which I understand Buzz gave a talk on a few years ago. And I know Holly does a lot of work in that area as well. Climate change and land-sea interactions. So the topic that I actually chose for today has to do with all 3 of those, because most things aren't easily shoved into a bin. We also focus a lot on graduate marine education, so we're doing a lot, particularly around the Monterey Bay area, to enhance graduate education in the marine area and to work with decision makers, so to try to bring some of that science right up through to policy making. Enough about that. So just a quick overview of what I hope to cover, a little bit anyways, is a few words on why I think the coast matters. and a few thoughts and evidence that we know about what climate change is going to, what changes it will bring to the open coast. I'm really focused on the open coast here. Once you're a coastal commissioner, you just sort of leave San Francisco Bay and the Delta behind, and you just say, BCDC is going to take care of all that. So you get very biased. It's, I admit it. And then talk a little bit about what the state is doing right now in thinking about coastal adaptation. And then kind of round it out with a few words of hope, I hope, about some options and some things that we need to be considering from a policy standpoint. So that's the plan of action. We'll see if we get detoured on the way. So aside from the fact that the coast, of course, of California is so iconic, and I really should have had a first slide here of the Big Sur coast and how magnificent the Lost Coast is and all of that, but you see those kinds of things all the time. The survey results that are represented here, and this is from one of those great PPIC surveys. This one was from 2006, and I'm a little upset that Mark Baldessari has not seen fit to repeat these questions recently. So I did put in a word with Ellen Hannock yesterday that can't he repeat these questions so that we can get a current read on how people are thinking about the coast. But this is pretty darn good. I mean, if you look at these statistics, 70% of Californians think that the condition of ocean and beaches is really critical to their quality of life. Over 60% think that it's really important to the economy. There's some other great statistics from this report. 88% of Californians say that condition of the ocean is personally important to them, and 60% say that it's very important to them. So we have a very strong affinity with the coast, and other questions in that survey from 2006 probed a bit more about, well, if you love the coast that much, what are you prepared to support? Hi, Leslie. Yay, Coastal Commission staffer back in the hall. And Californians said we do favor no-take marine reserves, which I'm spending a lot of my time, actually the last 6 years, helping to establish a network of marine protected areas in our state waters. They're all in favor of protecting wetlands and restricting coastal development and reducing pollution, and of course opposing oil drilling. And I think in the abstract, this is quite right. But when you get down to the particular, how people shake out when they're making trade-offs on an individual parcel basis is much more complex. Nonetheless, these statistics look really strong, very strong indeed. In fact, another point that is noteworthy about the PPIC survey is that the numbers were especially strong out of the Central Valley, and they were strong across political parties. I think some of the highest percentages actually came out of Latino households. So, we really have very deep and broad concern and interest in protecting our coasts. These are some numbers that Judy Kildall put together with her colleagues at the National Ocean Economics program. It's a program that may be snuffed out of existence for lack of funding as well. So, go jump on the web and download all of the reports that you possibly can, because I'm a little worried about this website disappearing in June. She's got this disclaimer on the front page of the website saying that it'll have to be taken down if there's not more funding. But
California or the nation?
Actually, it covers the nation. So she's got some studies on California. She's done a number of studies on Florida, and then just last year released a national study that looks particularly at the nation's coastal economy and with breakdowns by state. So it's really quite handy. And these statistics just give you an idea of just sort of how heavily weighted and the gravitational force of the coast and how important it is to us. not only because we have so many people residing in working along the coast, but it's such an important contributor to our GDP. And just the fact that shoreline counties are generating, 1.2 trillion in GDP annually is really quite impressive. The coastal economy and California ocean economy eclipses our agricultural economy. So, it's when you start lining it up against other sectors, it really holds its own. And this is just a little information about how you might break it down to understand what's really driving our ocean economy. And clearly it's tourism and recreation, really big players here. So, what is it about tourism and recreation that, what assets do tourism and recreation really depend on, and what kind of condition of our coastline and marine waters do good, healthy tourism and recreation depend on? And, I would argue that they are highly dependent on intact coastal and marine ecosystems, and certainly just from an aesthetic standpoint. But if you probe and you understand, what people are doing, they're going to hotels, they're going to the beaches. Beach tourism is actually the biggest segment of coastal tourism and recreation as a single segment. And when you go to the beach, what are you looking for? Ask yourself. You're looking for certainly a beach that's not closed to pollution, one that affords a lot of beach, a lot of sand. You're not having to climb and clamber over seawalls to get to it, and just a great, really, wonderful social experience. One of the folks from what used to be known as I think it is now the City Project in LA, Robert Garcia is his name, has actually written a number of pieces that argues that our beaches in California are really our town squares. They're our social gathering places. It's where people mix and sort of get to know people that they normally wouldn't encounter in their regular lives and interact. So there's a lot to be said for our coastline and how we experience it. Now, climate change, of course, is just kind of screwing everything up. Here is sort of a complex of impacts. Oh, I shouldn't say that. I'm being webcast, right? I'll have to watch that. A complex of impacts that climate change is visiting on our marine and coastal systems. And it would take me all night to talk about all of these, so I really just want to focus on the ones that are germane to sort of coastline and man-made structures, because I'm going to kind of zone in on coastal armoring for a little while, which has been a rant of mine for several years, but I figure if I keep talking about it, we'll make some headway on the policy side here in California. We've got this pernicious combination of rising sea levels and increased storms and intensity of storm events. We have naturally a highly erosive coastline. About 60% of the California coastline is in active state of erosion at any given time. That's just how it works. It's a dynamic system. When you add increased sea levels and increased storms and storm intensity to an already actively eroding coastline, you end up with something like this, which of course just happened in Pacifica. That hit the newspapers and all the TV stations. I normally don't watch local news, but the only thing that got me to watch it was I was dying to see what was going on with that apartment complex or condo complex in Pacifica, and just inundation or flooding. There was a fairly recent study, just want to make sure I get on this whole point of erosions. It's by Adams at 2009. And he estimated that erosion rates will actually increase by about 20% with a 1 meter increase in sea level. So we already have a very dynamic system, and we're talking about really dramatically elevating just how dynamic and erosive our coasts are. About 72% of the California coastline are bluffs, kind of this nature, and marine terraces, and you've got a mix of estuaries and beaches. So beaches actually don't predominate our coast. Most of it is this kind of stuff. And we do have, a variety. Not all landforms are quite this erosive. But as I mentioned, about 60% is actively sloughing off, which of course Oroville likes, because that adds sand to the system and can replenish our beaches if we allow that kind of active dynamism in the system. So sea level rise, what are we expecting? Well, we had an assessment done by the state. The California Energy Commission has been sponsoring a lot of research, and they basically looked to the IPCC and the Ramsdorf numbers and have been using just as sort of in a fallback position, something like, 1+ feet by mid-century and up to 55 inches by the end of the century. But the state, gosh, was it last year or the year before? I think it, anyways, in that time frame, decided that they really didn't want to just go with those numbers over the long haul. In the meantime, we'll be using those numbers for planning purposes, but they commissioned a National Academy of Sciences study along with Oregon and Washington to get better numbers, more accurate, downscaled, regional numbers for the state. And that study will not be available till the end of 2011 or so. So in the meantime, we're going to work with these other numbers that give us about 22 inches by mid-century and maybe 55 inches by the end of the century. Well, you can see right here, we're already experiencing a good deal of impact. These are just photos on top from Pacifica, and I'll talk about Pacifica later. And then the bottom slide is one of my favorite places of all time. It's Ocean Harbor House. It's a condominium complex in Monterey Bay, in the southern stretch of Monterey Bay, where we have erosion rates that are now up to about 6 feet a year. It's really unbelievable. I remember when I was first on the commission in 2004, 2005, and we talked about erosion rates in southern Monterey Bay of about 2 feet a year. And so Leslie's nodding, exactly. It's really quite alarming, and this condo complex is what we call pre-coastal. It was approved and built prior to the Coastal Act, which we'll also get into in a moment. So what are our responses to these kinds of impacts and change? Well, the most common response, whether you are state parks, which owns about 25% of the California coastline, manages about 25%, or you're Caltrans, or you're a private property owner, or you're a local jurisdiction with power, some kind of major infrastructure along the coast, a sewer line, something of that nature, the knee-jerk reaction is really to look to hard engineering to protect those assets. Whether it's a parking lot at a state beach or a sewer line, as I mentioned, along Bolinas Lagoon, for example, in Marin County. And the less common approaches are soft engineering, going to beach nourishment, although we're seeing a lot of that now. It's something that has been widely used on the East Coast and now is much more popular in California, especially down in Southern California, where, of course, so much of the local economy and culture really rests on the beach experience, but they actually have regional entities that oversee the regular replenishment of sand to those beaches. It's quite expensive, and if anyone, I don't happen to have a slide of it in this presentation, but have any of you seen a beach nourishment project underway? Yeah, what does it look like?
Pumping dirty water onto the beach and letting it create a new beach.
And like what size equipment is involved? D8s, D9s, whatever, big, you know, enormous equipment. And you know, when I first saw slides of what a beach nourishment project looked like, it looked to me like a Coastal Act violation that we should go after really, really quickly. You know, so it's funny because as a coastal commissioner, you're faced with, you know, really all sorts of very interesting behavior along the coastline, and you know, we were in the course of looking at a lot of bulldozing activity in Southern California. And then when I look at something which is a sanctioned activity of nourishing the beach, it looks really destructive to me. So there is some disturbance that occurs, of course, during the beach nourishment program. But there, as Jenny Dugan and some of her colleagues have noted, you know, there can be ways of actually carrying out beach nourishment that are more conducive to recovery and faster recovery of our beach systems. So there are actually our best management practices associated with beach nourishment that we should definitely be sure we're paying close attention to and trying to instill in those permits. Then there's these other contouring approaches of perched beaches and sandbars. You know, it's really just shaping the coastline, but not using hard structure. Accommodation and adaptation, actually using different building standards altogether. So for anyone who's familiar with the Santa Cruz area and that Del Mar beach area, which, you know, is just crazy. There's a road practically on the beach. Well, all of those houses at the bottom of that big bluff in that area, it's right around Aptos. All of the houses are built so that the mud and guck that's coming off the cliff behind them can blow right through the ground floor of the homes. And when, of course, it's super stormy and we've got super high tides, the waves can crash and inundate from the other side. And it happens on a regular basis. I had some friends who bought one of those houses and I just couldn't figure it out. But anyway, so we do that, and we've been doing, we've been using these kinds of building techniques for a long time. In Texas, for example, it's quite, you see pictures in the Galveston area well before the hurricane with homes that were, they're on stilts. So it's an approach that is used in Florida, elsewhere, that can be effective. The Carolinas, if you've got, appropriate building standards in place, and definitely has a reduced economic impact. But the thing that I'm really captivated by is the idea of what some people refer to as retreat or managed realignment. Removal could definitely fall into that category. It's moving out of harm's way and really thinking differently about how we live and work and recreate and use our coastline, and to essentially acknowledge that this is a very dynamic system for which we need a very dynamic and flexible approach. And I know that one of the things that I normally mention in the early slide about population, and we're expecting 3.7 million new people to move into coastal counties by 2025. Well, Will Travis would tell you, duh, it's because it's getting too damn hot in the Central Valley, and people are, it's going to be more attractive, basically, to be living along the coastline. So we've got this kind of collision course going on. And what do we do about the fact that sea level rise and storm intensity are compromising our ability to live and work and recreate along the coastline? So now, just going to a few things that I like to drag out the list of particulars about hard engineering along the coast. And a few really obvious ones, it really does have an impact on public access. Now, there are some seawalls, like the O'Shaughnessy seawall, which Linda and I were talking about and as we were walking through the archives up in Ocean Beach in San Francisco, arguably enhances public access. It allows for that parking lot to be located right along Ocean Beach. It gives folks who can't necessarily, go down on the beach for mobility reasons, the ability, an opportunity to see it and enjoy it. So, I recognize that there are some coastal developments that really do fall into that category. But many along our coast, and about 12% of California's coastline is currently armored in one way or another, actually can really be impediments to public access. Here we've got this combination of riprap and then this funky, slope seawall, and somehow these people are finding, they must be European. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Has anybody camped in Europe? You're cheek by jowl, so different sense of space. I'm just kidding. I don't know. One of the things that has concerned me a great deal is habitat loss. Beaches are really interesting ecosystems. And, it's easy to just look at sand and believe that there's really nothing going on there. But in fact, they're very complex ecosystems. Jenny Dugan has documented this very well. There are a number of Australians who have produced some really good work in this area. And when we, throw riprap on the beach or, add these seawalls, we're taking up space, we're replacing habitat with man-made structures, and we're preventing that erosive dynamic action that I referred to earlier by stabilizing our cliffs and shoreline. We're preventing that new sand and sediment from entering the system. And in many cases, although probably not all, seawalls can actually contribute to enhanced erosion, active erosion. And then there's just the loss of space occupied by the structures themselves. Whoops, I went back. So I just wanted to give you a little tour of some of the stuff that we have along the California coastline. I love this one on the right. I mean, just imagine what that experience is like. And I've actually fairly recently hiked along the beach at Ocean Beach in San Francisco and walked towards the sewage treatment plant. And, there's a lot of stuff down there. There's a lot of riprap. And when the tide is high and the waves are high, it's really dangerous. It becomes a public safety problem to try to navigate between one end of the beach and the other. So you can see here that this is all, easily wet sand beach that these folks are standing on in front of this vertical wall. And it will be impassable during a high tide, when it comes. So the issue of habitat loss is really in front of us. And Piedras Blancas, which is the center photograph here, is actually a really great story, or sort of great story anyways. I think it's a great story. This is an elephant seal rookery that the elephant seals decided to habituate. And historically, they weren't there. I'm trying to think when they showed up. It was in the last 10 to 15 years, I believe, fairly recent, that the elephant seals began to occupy this area. And the beach here is very narrow, and right behind you, if you imagine that you're the photographer snapping this photo of these elephant seals, right behind you is Highway 1. And this is actually an instance where the encroaching ocean and a real problem with sand and erosion on Highway 1 actually motivated Caltrans, probably in deep consultation with the Coastal Commission staff, to realign Highway 1 in this area and actually move it back, move it landward, so that we could accommodate these marine mammals. This is a really good photo just to show the active erosion that can take place as a result of shoreline armoring. And you probably wonder, why is a lawyer talking about it? But this worries me, this really does. So you can see this creates the peninsula effect here with beach on the north and south and all that various colors. Gosh, it looks like a, color by number photo here of the different colors of gravel and riprap that were put into place. This is again, back in Monterey in the Fort Ord area. This was the Officers Club, had a great view of the ocean. And over time, they just continued to pour more material on the beach and finally gave up and removed the Officers Club in 2004. So here's a case of just removal. Of course, the military base was also closing, so that seemed like perhaps a suitable thing to do. But they could have continued to try to fortify that coastline. And what's really cool, and I wish I had the photo of what it looks like right now, but the beach is back. The beach is back here. And so now getting to policy and what the discourse has been in California. So Ellen Hennick, whom I mentioned earlier, and her colleagues at PPIC have been probing this issue. Former student and I, Craig Siegel, published an article in 2007 that we'd worked on for a little bit before then. And Ellen and her co-author picked up on a lot of that and really tried to pull some of this into the public spotlight, as PPIC is really good at doing. And in the meantime, our governor, who really has been creating quite an ocean legacy with the installation of marine protected areas, recognized the importance of having an adaptation strategy for the state, given the really intense changes and impacts that we can anticipate, not just along the coastline, but certainly with freshwater systems and, throughout the entire state, energy, you name it. So what's great about these two reports is they actually coincide really nicely on the coastal and ocean arena. And I participated in the California Climate Adaptation Strategy Working Group on Coast and Ocean, as did Leslie Ewing, who's actually the Coastal Commission's engineer, and a number of other Coastal Commission staffers. And I know that we worked very hard to try to make sure that some of the overarching policies of the Coastal Act itself, which speaks to habitat protection and sensitive ecosystem protection and public access, really could be carried through with the state's adaptation strategy. But I'm going to just call out the recommendations that were made in the PPIC report first, and then go to the adaptation strategy and what it says. The first thing is count what you've got. Inventory your coastal resources. Find out what you have so that you can determine what's vulnerable and how you can help enhance the resiliency of these resources in the face of climate change. And then identify opportunities for landward migration. So this notion of managed realignment and retreat really resonated with the PPIC folks. And it does make sense. Take humans and their structures and move them out of harm's way when and if you can. Of course, assess the vulnerabilities of our assets, and particularly our coastal infrastructure, of which there's a great deal. And I know that the Pacific Institute has estimated the value of our coastal infrastructure, and it's in the tens of billions, right? Yes, I think so. It's in my notes here. But quite significant. They've done some discrete estimates for San Mateo County, for example, that are quite high. I might be able to pull those in a second. I'll just keep going. Trust me, it's big. And then, of course, provide some guidelines on sea level rise to agencies, our coastal agencies, resource agencies who have jurisdiction along the California coast, and give them what Ellen and her co-author called a regulatory boost. There's a lot of literature out there about voluntary strategies and peppering these voluntary strategies with a little bit of money, of course, can go a little ways with our state agencies, but there's nothing like mandatory to catch the attention of our regulatory agencies. And a lot of folks would refer to those as unfunded mandates. Of course, they can operate as that. But we also find that, and Ellen has cited this in her work, that particularly with local jurisdictions, and the Coastal Commission works in partnership with local jurisdictions. About 88% of California coastline is actually directly regulated by our local cities and counties by virtue of certified local coastal programs. So you think the Coastal Commission's making all of the development decisions along the coast, when in fact the vast majority of those decisions and application reviews are actually conducted by local cities and counties. And a very small percentage of those decisions actually reside with the Coastal Commission. So those local actors in particular do admit when they're asked that it's much easier for them to fall back on a state mandate when they have to make tough choices, like managed realignment or retreat, or removal of some key infrastructure. And finally, they recommended that we actively pursue alternatives to coastal armoring. The one thing that Ellen and her co-author, and I certainly have been doing a lot of discussion and talking about, is the idea of this rolling easement. It's actually a concept that was brought into popularity by this guy, Jim Titus, who works at US EPA in the East Coast. And he was so concerned about the impacts of climate change along our coastlines that Jim, who was a staff analyst, I think actually has a science background, ended up going to the University of Maryland to get his law degree just so he could write a law review article to really get this stuff out. I'm sure it's not that simple, but he does tell that story. And the whole idea behind the rolling easement is that, there you are today with your house on stilts, presumably for the view along the coastline, but as sea level rises and you do experience some erosion along the coastline, you have an ever intruding high water line that by the time you get to plus 80 years, it's the public trust property. You can see that dotted line actually divides private property from public trust property, shifts. Not every state takes exactly this point of view, but this certainly is reflective of how California law, presumably, is supposed to work, where everything from the mean high tide line seaward is public trust property for which the state has an ongoing responsibility, stewardship responsibilities to protect, and stuff above the mean high tide line can be public or private depending on its fee ownership. So the idea here is that if you don't allow the public's right to continue to move landward, you will reach a point where you lose that public trust property altogether. You're extinguishing that right. So Jim Titus's proposal was that you actually recognize the public trust property as if it were a rolling easement. And at the point where the public and the private meet at a structure, that is the time that the structure should be removed. Well, putting this in, conceptually it's easy to talk about, I suppose, but putting it into practice is a whole nother matter. Here's just a few quotes about how strong our public trust doctrine is in California. The famous Mono Lake case that really talked about it being very broad indeed. It's a common law doctrine, so It's flexible and has changed over time and has been interpreted to protect ecosystem function in addition to all sorts of things like in-stream flows and protection of species, but also for protection of public recreation. And we have court cases in California that make it clear that the trust, the line that delineates the border between public trust property and private property actually moves. It's a dynamic line that can and should move. So we seem to have like everything in place, a public trust doctrine, this notion of an ambulatory line. Why can't we make it happen in practice? Well, because we have really expensive assets and individuals for whom their own private property is quite important, and they've been enjoying, an incredible experience along the California coast, and who would want to give that up? So we end up with this kind of solution more often than not when we face that choice. It's particularly vexing to me because the Coastal Act that went into effect as a statute in 1976 has a couple of different provisions in it. One provision basically says that it's the Coastal Commission's responsibility to ensure that any new development, all right, we accept the stuff that's already been deployed along our coastline, but any new development really needs to be designed and located in a way that will prevent any future armoring to actually, protect that property in the future. So you have to take into account the dynamic system. Before we were so smart about climate change, we were just looking at things like historic erosion rates, but now the Coastal Commission is looking at the projected impacts of climate change and trying to really rejigger the way it looks at required setbacks, for example. And then there's another provision in the Coastal Act that says basically if your existing structure is in imminent danger of, well, this is the way it's interpreted, of being in jeopardy of inundation, and it's interpreted within about 2 to 3 storm cycles, you can apply for a seawall, and it's a qualified privilege, but it's very difficult for the Commission to deny those applications, as you might think. And in the late 90s, the Commission got kind of really wise about this and started requiring no future armoring provisions in their coastal development permits. Because, of course, if you read that earlier provision of the Coastal Act that I referred to, that there should be no armoring required. So design your structure so that it won't need it, and put your money where your mouth is and sign up for this deed restriction that will preclude you from getting any kind of armoring in the future. Well, we're just starting to get those property owners who had those deed restrictions coming back to the Commission and asking for armoring now. And there have been a couple instances where the Commission has seen fit to allow some armoring. Very factually, interesting cases. The most recent one involves neighbors who weren't subject to such a condition, who had seawalls and need their neighbor to also have a seawall to have a continuous, form of defense. So that's a little bit of a sideline on the Commission, but it's quite important because it really infers that, that law that has been static on that point since 1976, really, I think, needs to be revisited in how we're interpreting it, and we need to think about it in the context of this highly dynamic system. Then the state came out with this adaptation strategy, and again, you're hearing the same kinds of things: avoid future hazards, don't put things in harm's way, protect critical habitat, and develop some statewide guidance for our agencies. And in fact, we do have some state agencies that have moved forward with some policies of their own. The BCDC that governs development around the rim of San Francisco Bay and the Coastal Conservancy are among them. And strong support for helping out those local jurisdictions that I referred to that are controlling 88% of our coastline. I use Malibu as an example here just because it's kind of fun, because the commission actually had to write their local coastal plan because the city of Malibu refrained from doing so, and finally a state law was passed fairly recently that required the commission to just step in and do it for them. The problem with these local coastal programs, of course, Malibu is not a problem because the commission made sure that it lives up to the expectations of the Coastal Act and the protective features of the act. But for all those other jurisdictions that already have certified local coastal programs, there's nothing that actually allows the Coastal Commission to go back and say, revise those plans to take into account climate change. The commission does not have the authority to require the local coastal programs to actually be updated in light of new science and new information about climate change. So that's, again, another area that's sort of ripe for revisiting and thinking about that. And of course, we have examples of this all the time in our land use laws. For affordable housing, for example, we have a requirement that every 5 years you revisit your housing element to make sure you're keeping up with your fair share of affordable housing. Not a very popular provision in some communities, but we've seen fit to do that where we figured out that this was a matter of statewide concern. But one jurisdiction really impressed me, and that was San Diego. There's this effort that was funded through the San Diego Foundation in 2008, I think, or 2009. And they took a really thoughtful review of that entire jurisdiction from the coast all the way landward, and really looked very carefully about what changes they should expect as a jurisdiction, and came up with these 4 recommendations for San Diego and the entire county. Again, these are completely in league with the recommendations that Craig Siegel and I and Ellen Hannock and the adaptation strategy have really been promoting. And then finally, get a better idea of what our vulnerability is. This is an old map that kind of the big globs show you sort of high, intensity of vulnerable roadways. And so you get a sense, but this is sort of the old mapping. The new mapping is much more nuanced and really gives you a much finer grain ability to assess what your vulnerability is and to look on a more parcel by parcel basis, or at least a small regional basis. The state itself has been looking at its own geospatial information along the coast and is looking at ways to do a better job of collecting that data and sharing it. And most recently, Assemblymember Ruskin actually has a bill that just went through committee that would actually ask our Ocean Protection Council to facilitate that kind of data collection and sharing so that all the agencies are working from the same baseline of information. So what do we get out of this? Well, of course, we want to protect some critical infrastructure, and I should also say that the public trust doctrine is used by State Lands Commission to allow some significant development in our submerged lands areas and our wet areas, if you will, of the state. So it's a very flexible doctrine. It allows for the installation of docks and harbors and marinas and, heavy-duty infrastructure of that nature, but it also calls for the protection of ecosystem function. So my belief is that this very flexible common law doctrine can be used both to protect really key infrastructure and allow some defense mechanisms there, but also to really promote and help guide managed realignment so that we can allow our coastal ecosystems to actually migrate landward. And So this is what I think we get out of using this doctrine in a flexible and more thoughtful way. So this is the hope part. We have a couple of good examples in California of where managed realignment has been used. This is prior to, in fact, I don't know where Surfers Point is in the actual implementation of this project, but incredibly famous beach. My friends at the Surfrider Foundation love this beach. It's heavily used. Millions of people go there every year, and it was suffering from the coastal squeeze between Highway 1 and the parking lot that you see there, and an encroaching ocean, and really high erosion rates there. And so what the clever folks in Ventura County, and of course it helped with a new mayor that was really interested in moving forward with a more ecosystem-friendly approach, did is they turned San Pedro, well, Ventura is, I'm trying to think, that's not San Pedro, that's Ventura River, right? Kind of reestablish a river mouth there that's a functioning ecosystem as opposed to a channelized system, which is what they were looking at before with the Army Corps of Engineers, and move some of that coastal armoring back. So this is the vision for managed realignment and working with our ecosystems and our coastal infrastructure. Here's an example of a finished product in Pacifica. There used to be a couple of houses right next door to that Taco Bell that is located, that's a Taco Bell. See the seawall there? Well, what happened is they ran out of funding. So they were able to buy the houses that were located, I think they were on this side. They were able to move the parking lot, get rid of that parking lot, recontour the dunes, get the bike path through, but they weren't yet able to buy out the Taco Bell. So that's still part of the general plan in Pacifica. They're hoping to get the funding together to do that, to basically, reestablish a healthy beach ecosystem, which is also a very popular surf spot. And then I just want to say a few words about flood insurance and disaster relief. One of my PhD students actually just completed her dissertation, and she's got one whole chapter on our insurance system. And the thing is that it really is counterproductive in the coastal zone. First of all, we've got the old problem with old flood mapping, and the Army Corps of Engineers is, trying to move forward with updating those maps. But what we commonly refer to as a 100-year, flood zone is so not a 100-year flood zone anymore, and particularly along the coast. So they're about 15 years old. They're looking only at historic data. They're looking backwards, not forwards. So there's a problem there. But also the fact that our flood insurance is really controlled at the federal level. And the way disaster relief works is, the feds are kind of sending all the wrong price signals, because you end up with a situation like this. It's declared a disaster, then you're eligible for disaster relief funds to either rebuild, or in the case of Pacifica, to move. We've had houses that actually were households that were given $250,000 each to move. And then you can write off that disaster relief in your tax, return. So it's sending all the wrong price signals for people. It's really a bailout system and a subsidy system for folks who are locating in hazardous areas along the coast. So there's so many things that kind of need to be fixed there. And of course, this was called out by both Ellen Hannock in her report and in the California Coastal Adaptation Strategy document, that the state actually is in a position to maybe start to move the dial a little bit. We actually do have a regulatory role with insurance companies. We could require some rate restructuring that would help send some different signals. And we have started doing this in our Central Valley. SB 5 that was passed in 2007, it was a bill that was sponsored by Senator Machado, actually calls for this kind of revamping of the program where, redetermining what the real flood zones are in the Central Valley requires actually review and revision of all the general plans in the Central Valley, and requires the state to actually help out with, broad-scale regional planning. And it should start to send different price signals with home insurance. But it's too early to tell how well that's working, in part because the state has needed some time to develop their own zonation for that area, and we haven't really seen it trickle through the system to know whether or not SB 5 is the kind of approach that would work for our coastal area. So I'm looking forward to seeing some empirical research on that. And I already talked about local coastal programs. We talked about all these issues of managed realignment, so I'm not going to revisit that. But I'll just end it here, and this is the bike path actually at Surfers Point in Ventura County. And this is partly why that other vision of managed realignment came into being, because it just wasn't working. This bike path was continually being inundated and suffering from erosion. It's a really important piece of our coastal infrastructure, but why not just get it out of harm's way and reestablish the beach, which everybody knows and loves. All right, so I'll take questions now, I suppose, right?
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, please ask your question, wait for the mic so that we can get your question on the tape.
Yes, first of all, congratulations on an excellent presentation, but I basically disagree.
Oh, Arvel, go for it.
The basic question is, why is the coast eroding in the first place, and what is causing it? So in my opinion, the lack of sediment supply to the coast is reducing the beaches, which dissipate the waves. So I'd like to see the Coastal Commission authority extended into rivers and streams, or some state look at that. So basically, how do we control the amount of sediment? And I think you showed Pacifica. I consider sand mining in San Francisco Bay may be causing erosion in Pacifica. So the question is, how do we understand this issue? It's very complex, and we really need to look at the whole issue of what's causing the erosion. And if they're due to anthropogenic activities, we could at least either tax them. It's the unpriced externality of not considering the cost of those activities.
Yeah, very good point. It's almost as if I asked you to ask that question, because the Ventura County example is a really good one where the state did look holistically at this. And in fact, the players, the Surfrider Foundation and other NGOs who were very supportive of this project, also wanted to be sure that the state was paying attention to the Matilaha Dam, which dams the Ventura River and is almost completely filled with sediment. So historically, and the Coastal Conservancy commissioned a report some time ago that looked at, what is the sediment supply, the natural sediment supply for the coast, and the estimate was something on the order of 70% or so of the sediment that enters our the littoral cell on the coastline historically has come from our riverine systems. Well, what have we done to our river systems? We've dammed them. So we've really prevented that influx of sediment from those systems. And yes, the coastal bluffs also contribute, but a huge player here are the riverine systems. So part and parcel of this project is the removal of the Matilaha Dam. Now, it's going to be the first major dam removal in the state, and the planning involved there is pretty significant. So there's one example of doing the right thing, looking holistically. The dam's not down yet, but it looks like it's moving ahead. The funding's there to take care of it. Yeah.
The other question, you showed Monterey. As you know, there's been sand mining in Monterey since before World War I. A huge sand mining. And I've written papers, you've seen my papers, I'm sure. But actually, there's still, the question is, if we mine sand long enough, we simply take away the coastal sand. So the question is sand mining in Monterey Bay causing beaches to go away? And the question is, we've mined before World War I, that 1910 or something they started, and they've been hauling it away with train loads constantly. So they're mining directly from the beach in those days, and I believe it's all stopped except maybe one. There's a discussion of the last one perhaps being stopped. So if you're mined and right next to it you have erosion, perhaps there's a connection between the sand mining on the beach and in the water along the coast and the erosion.
Yeah, I understand that that's an active question right now before several state agencies. So I can't comment on that, but I know that you've been really effective along with some other coastal engineers in bringing that to the state's attention. So I'm looking forward to how things unfold on that question.
My question will not piggyback on Orville's. I'm a historian of coasts, and I'm fascinated with your talk. I thought it was excellent in every respect, except there's a kind of missing element in your analysis, and that is coastal people.
Yes, it did say coastal communities, didn't it?
Yeah, but what do you mean by that? Because the people surging to the coast now are uncoastal people. They have no experience with the sea, much less with sand, except to lie on it. And in fact, how are any of these transformations that you suggest going to occur until we get or return to an informed, experienced coastal population who actually know what they're doing on the edge of the sea? I spend a lot of time in Maine, and there the working waterfronts of Maine have shrunk from, of the total coast available, about 5,000 miles to 24 miles. That is now your, in my view, your coastal population. What you're describing seems to me not to be a coastal population at all, but an interior population which is colonized and in effect is creating its own destructive habits, or is bringing destructive habits. You want to comment on that? Well, I know this is difficult, but yeah, it seems to me the core of the problem.
So I'll just take it on face value that as a historian, you've got a characterization of coastal communities. That's a really interesting question, though, because I haven't really seen any surveys that probe that issue. And we've got the great surveys about how everybody loves the beach, but what the kind of the mental paradigm for coastal dwellers, what that really is, and how they view their relationship with these systems. So in this regard, I'm an incrementalist and maybe just a pragmatist. And so I am only too happy just to start with entities like state agencies. The state parks, it controls 25% of the coastline, for goodness sakes, and just start to show the art of the possible with our state agencies. And then move to, local jurisdictions and their capital improvement planning and infrastructure decisions, which of course are, largely funded through, state and federal funding, and require that those two really engage in this sort of managed realignment pathway. So that, of course, doesn't speak to your question very well, but it's the only way that I can start to think about really making headway here and showing what is possible, because it's very difficult to deal with this just on a one-off private property basis.
Just curious, and just not only mentioning the public trust doctrine, actually saying it can do something. That's fantastic.
Well, no one's written a brief based on my law review article yet, but I'm waiting.
When you have an attorney general and a legislature that wants to restrict the attorney general from defending state agencies when they are trying to defend public rights, and then Okay, but just with the public trust doctrine, it's very difficult to get compensated as an attorney trying to take on a case like that, because I guess down in, there was one in Southern California where the value, okay, the case was won on behalf of the public, but the value was in terms of the value of construction, but there was no construction because the case was won, so there was nothing of public benefit conferred. And I was wondering if you've worked at all, like with all the perverse incentives on insurance, there's also tremendously perverse incentives in terms of, trying to defend public rights on the coast. And I was wondering if you had any experience with that.
I'm not sure this will be satisfactory, but the same student, PhD student who just completed her dissertation, has her final chapter is on givings and takings. So in thinking through this, the larger equation of value and what's lost and what's given, she is looking at the whole concept of givings, and what, through government actions and government policies, what signals and what value are local jurisdictions and the state conferring on coastal properties just by virtue of sort of living and breathing and doing their normal stuff, and having the regulations and the the subsidies basically in place for coastal property owners. It's a novel approach. I don't know, where you can take that. As for this question of prosecuting cases on the public trust, yes, the state is strapped. The AG's office is already, trying to look at very clever ways to make sure that it can defend our state agencies and cover its costs. And in fact, this is an issue right now with the Coastal Commission. So I'm not smarter people than I are trying to work on that question, and I don't have an easy answer for you. But let me just maybe shift a teeny bit on this issue of value, because it's a point that I know I've been thinking a lot about, and that is when we do allow a seawall to be constructed, like the example of that big condo complex in southern Monterey that predated the Coastal Act, we've gotten really good about thinking about lost recreational value. When we allow a seawall, the riprap, whatever, we're thinking ahead about how the beach will be lost. Eventually in fact, right now, on a high tide, you can't traverse that beach in front of that condo complex. So you have clear lost recreational value, for which we can assign dollars. We've got great, economists now and who help us think through that, and travel cost method is what we happen to use, I think, in that instance. And you can actually calculate it over time until the beach is completely, gone. But what we haven't done as a state is looked at lost ecosystem value and attached any kind of monetary amount to that. And it's starting to get to this whole question of value that I think you were raising, or maybe I'm just riffing in the wrong direction, but we haven't done that yet, and it's very difficult to do it. I mean, you think about how to attach value to these coastal systems. It goes well beyond just the pure number of people who go there every day and how much they paid for gas and parking to get there. All right, well, a rhetorical question, maybe a rhetorical answer, I don't know.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question. First, thank you for an excellent presentation. In thinking about the value of our coastal systems, which you were beginning to speak of, and you made a very good case just how valuable they are, I'd like to ask you a question you didn't really address in your presentation, but I think you have the background with your legal and regulatory experience. And it sounds like you have background in marine protected areas as well. There's been some recent and sophisticated analysis showing that there's a big gap in protection on the Pacific Northwest coast, basically extending from around Cape Mendocino, Northern California, to north of Cape Blanco, about midpoint on the Oregon coast. Now, there may be a process beginning to provide some significant protection for that, a la National Marine Sanctuary or other kinds of marine protected area. Experience with setting up the Tortugas Ecological Reserve in Florida, where there were a lot of jurisdictions involved, and getting them all to take consistent actions is quite a challenge. Now, in this case, with California and Oregon, a large one crossing that boundary, can you provide some insights, advice on how to deal with that, a two-state potential protected area?
Yeah, great question. So you're right. We have two really major biogeographical breaks in sort of the California large marine ecosystem in California, and one of them is at Point Conception, and the other one is around Mendocino, the place you indicated. And the genetics are all different. It's really, really interesting. So the Marine Life Protection Act process that I've been involved in since 2004, that's a statute that was passed in 1999, the objective of which is to establish a network of marine protected areas in California state waters. The way we've implemented it is by region, and we are right now in that region of which you speak. We're in the North Coast region right now, looking sort of early stages, and have science advisory team and the stakeholder group helping to develop initial proposals for marine protected areas in that very section. So as between federal and state, so we can only go out to 3 miles, the expectation is, and Obama has issued an executive order asking for a framework for marine spatial planning, and the federal agencies have been working on that. We expect over time that the federal agencies will be looking at our state marine protected areas and trying to figure out if it makes sense to complement them in federal waters, as they have done in the Channel Islands, for example. So that's looking out to the 200-mile EEZ. But then looking north, well, we have a mechanism for engaging Oregon in this discussion, and that's this West Coast Governors Agreement between California, Oregon, and Washington. And actually, if you look at the West Coast Governors Agreement and their strategy documents, they actually speak to this question of marine protected areas and looking regionally at developing protected areas that are cross-jurisdictional. So it's conceivable that we'll get there. Some groundwork has been laid to actually pursue a cross-jurisdictional marine protected area. But as you might guess, it's very controversial. It's tough work getting these MPAs in place. And Oregon right now is actually pursuing its own state approach to establishing marine protected areas, and they've got a very different process than we have. So I would say it's early yet to figure out whether or not we can get there, but we should have marine protected areas up before the Fish and Game Commission, State Fish and Game Commission for the North Coast, and that'll be our final segment of the open coast by the end of this year.
Meg, I'd like to bring you back to coastal communities for a little bit. I'm intrigued by the idea that perhaps the communities that exist along the coast now aren't really the coastal communities that there would have been 40 and 50 years ago. And it seems that one of the things we used to have along the coast were that people would build rather small, expendable buildings with the expectation that waves would be a factor along the coast and that there would be erosion. And we've flipped that around now so that our coastal property is probably the most valuable and high risk. So how do we get away from the idea that the most expensive properties are the most at risk and thus the most of value to protect, when the properties just to the inland of those could take on those values if we were to let the property erode and transfer that value in as natural processes would occur, except that we've locked that value into the properties that exist there today?
Yeah, and I mean, you could almost make the argument that there's a real windfall there for the coastally adjacent property owners. I I wish I had an answer for you that was satisfactory. I will say that the economic analysis that's been done on this question of coastal versus slightly inland, there have been a couple studies done on the East Coast looking at the valuation of properties that are inland, a block or around a block inland from coastal properties that have erected seawalls. And the value of those block-in properties actually goes down by a significant amount. It's in the 5 to 15% range, I believe. So there's a cost, there's an externality there that the coastal dwellers are visiting on their neighbors that is completely uncompensated right now. So yes, it gets you starting to think about structuring a market, thinking about this differently. The way I've been trying to think about it, at least for California, is trying to think of compensation approaches to use clever compensation approaches that help effectuate this rolling easement concept, especially where it's quadruply vexing when you've got one property owner who is pre-coastal and another property owner who's post-coastal and another property owner who had the no future armoring provision. So, it doesn't really work very well, as you know, in those cases. So just trying to think through the economics of when do you need to compensate and how much, and what should the algorithm look like? If you really want to get serious about some managed realignment in particular areas, say, very highly valuable coastal ecosystems that you do want to provide some leeway for landward migration. And I wish I were an economist too, because I would love to come up with some great answers, but what I have done is sat down with economists and explained the law and said, there might be some breakpoints here and here and here. And then how would you look at compensation from an economist standpoint?
I'm worried about one aspect of your suggestions and analysis. The coastline, as you've shown us it, is essentially rural or relatively empty. But the vast majority of coastal people are urban. They live in Los Angeles or in the Bay Area here or in other major cities. And this is true not only on the California coast, but worldwide. And sea level rise, climate change and sea level rise are going to be impacting these urban populations on a major basis at an enormous cost in terms of what can be done to protect them, far beyond the resources of California or any other particular state. And I'm wondering about the prospects of relying on federal aid here and on federal initiatives, especially when one thinks back to New Orleans and the impact of Hurricane Katrina there and the role of the Corps of Engineers. Are there any ways in which you can think of organizing federal agencies for some coordinated concern with this problem of coastal, of sea level rise?
Yeah, it's as if you were sitting in on the Maggie's dissertation defense, because this was the last topic that we talked about. Mike Orbach, who co-chairs her committee with me from Duke University, started talking about exactly this. And what we really need to be thinking about is moving entire metropolitan areas, and definitely doing it after major crises like Katrina, not rebuilding in the same place. And culturally, we don't seem to be there yet, and I don't know what it's going to take. As I mentioned before, I'm after some incrementalism to show what's possible, but many people who have been working in this area think that it is going to take a series of really tremendous crises to get, and at significant cost, to get folks' attention so that there is, and we have vehicles. We have the Coastal Zone Management Act. So there, we do actually have vehicles that we can use to change behavior by coastal states. We just haven't really flexed those muscles yet. And the Coastal Zone Management Act is a federal statute that, for which there's quid pro quo. You agree to have a state coastal program that meets the following, criteria, and in exchange you get a little money, state, and you get the benefit of reviewing federal actions, federally permitted or federally funded or federally carried out actions in your state waters or outside of your state waters that might affect your coastal or marine resources. So good quid pro quo there. But the feds could probably go a bit further with substantive requirements in the Coastal Zone Management Act. We just haven't done that yet.
One last question.
Oh no, another silly question.
I would just like to say, I love that slide because you see where it's armored is still there. If you look at it, so you're demonstrating, I'm being a little facetious here, that the armoring is saving the walk, and where it's unarmored, it's lost. So it's a good picture to show. Shows seawalls work.
Something's wrong with that. It used to be, well, there's another statement that I've heard frequently, and that, Mother Nature bats last. So these, any form of coastal engineering eventually fails in one form or another. Now, O'Shaughnessy seawall is, holding firm, but most of our coastal armoring is not of that kind of, design and magnitude. So this is an example of Mother Nature batting last.
I just want to say one thing is I'm glad, Meg, you were up here fielding those questions. Those were some really tough questions. So thank you all for coming, and one more time, let's thank Meg.
Thank you.